In this episode, we take up the 3 lines of defense model, which is one of the clearest ways to understand how organizations divide responsibility for risk without turning everything into confusion, duplication, or finger-pointing. For a brand new learner, the model matters because it answers a very practical question that shows up in almost every business environment. Who is supposed to manage risk in daily work? Who is supposed to guide and oversee that work? And who is supposed to step back and check whether the whole system is actually functioning the way leadership believes it is? That may sound simple at first, but many organizations struggle badly with exactly those questions. When responsibilities blur, teams assume someone else is handling the issue. Leadership receives weak information, and problems that should have been caught early begin moving through the business until they become much more expensive or embarrassing to fix. The 3 lines of defense model give structure to that problem by showing that different groups can all contribute to risk management while still having distinct jobs, perspectives, and forms of accountability. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A useful way to understand the model is to stop thinking about risk as one department's problem and start thinking about it as a shared business responsibility that needs clear layers of action and review. The first line is closest to the actual work of the organization and deals with risk as part of daily operations. The second line helps create consistency by providing guidance, oversight, and challenge to the first line so that local decisions do not drift too far from enterprise expectations. The third line provides independent assurance, usually through internal audit, IA, so leadership can hear whether the overall system is working rather than relying only on self-reporting from the people running the processes. The model matters because these roles are different for a reason. If the same group designs the work, performs the work, judges its own success, and reports the results upward with no real challenge, the organization becomes vulnerable to blind spots, overconfidence, and a very polished version of reality that may not match what is happening on the ground. The first line of defense is made up of the people and teams that own and operate the business processes every day. These are the managers, supervisors, staff members, and operational leaders who carry out the organization's core activities and who experience risk not as theory, but as part of daily work. If a business unit handles customer payments, manages vendor relationships, processes patient records, fulfills orders, or maintains manufacturing systems, then the people responsible for those activities sit in the first line. Their job is not merely to produce output as fast as possible. Their job is to do that work in a way that also respects control expectations, policy requirements, process discipline, and acceptable risk boundaries. This is why the first line is so important in CRISC. Risk management begins where work is actually happening. If the first line ignores control steps, accepts weak data, delays reporting, or treats standards like suggestions, no amount of oversight from higher levels will fully repair the damage. Daily operational ownership is where risk becomes real. One of the most important lessons for beginners is that the first line does not simply hand risk to security, compliance, or audit and walk away. The first line owns the risk that arises from the business activities it performs and the objectives it is trying to achieve. That means a process owner, business manager, or operations leader cannot honestly say that risk belongs only to the technical specialist just because systems are involved. If a customer onboarding process exposes sensitive information, if a production workflow can be interrupted by poor access control, or if a financial process has weak review steps, the business still owns the outcome because the risk exists in relation to a business objective. Specialists may support the analysis and the control design, but the first line remains responsible for how the work actually happens. That is one reason the model is so useful. It prevents the organization from pretending that risk is a separate technical cloud floating above the business. It reminds everyone that the people closest to the process are also closest to the consequences of failure. The second line of defense exists because organizations need more than local ownership if they want risk to be handled consistently across the enterprise. The second line typically includes risk management, compliance, security governance, privacy leadership, policy functions, and similar groups that are responsible for shaping expectations, advising the business, monitoring trends, and challenging weak decisions before they become bigger problems. These teams usually do not own the day-to-day business process itself, but they do help define what good risk management should look like and whether the first line is operating within approved boundaries. A good way to think about the second line is that it creates enterprise discipline. It helps make sure one department is not inventing its own standards while another is operating under a completely different understanding of acceptable practice. In CRISC, this matters because risk management needs consistency as well as ownership. Without the second line, the organization may have many well-meaning local managers, but leadership still may not have a reliable way to compare exposures, interpret risk information, or trust that enterprise expectations are being applied evenly. The second line also plays an important educational role, even though people sometimes focus only on its oversight function. In a healthy organization, these teams do not exist only to criticize or slow everyone down. They help the first line understand policies, standards, risk appetite, reporting requirements, and common control expectations so that the business can make better decisions before trouble appears. This guidance can be especially valuable when the organization is changing quickly, entering a new market, adopting new technology, or dealing with updated legal and regulatory demands. A local manager may understand operations deeply, but still need help interpreting how those business changes affect risk across the enterprise. The second line helps bridge that gap by bringing a broader perspective. It can also spot patterns that individual teams cannot see because it looks across units, functions, and issue types rather than staying inside one local process. That enterprise view is one of its real strengths. The second line helps leadership see whether isolated issues are actually part of a larger theme involving culture, governance, vendor management, or uneven control maturity. The third line of defense is different again, and its value depends largely on independence. In many organizations, the third line is performed by IA, which provides assurance to leadership and the board by evaluating whether governance, risk management, and controls are designed and operating effectively. The third line is not supposed to run the business process, own the risk, or become the day-to-day advisor for every operational decision. Its role is to step back, assess the system more independently, and report candidly on whether management's view of reality can be trusted. This is vital because both the first and second lines are still part of management structures and may have biases, blind spots, performance pressures, or local loyalties that affect how problems are described. The third line helps leadership hear a less filtered version of the truth. In CRISC terms, that independent assurance matters because governance is stronger when people at the top do not have to rely entirely on self-reporting from the same groups responsible for meeting targets, managing deadlines, and defending their own performance. A beginner sometimes assumes the third line must be smarter or more powerful than the first two lines, but that is not the best way to understand it. The third line is not there because the first and second lines are unimportant. It is there because even strong operational and oversight teams can still miss things, especially when business pressure, familiarity, or internal politics shape what gets noticed or emphasized. Independence creates a different kind of value than expertise alone. An auditor who is not responsible for the daily outcome of a process can often ask questions that operational leaders may avoid or may not even think to raise. That independence also helps with credibility. When the third line reports to leadership that a control design is weak, that reporting carries a different weight because it comes from a group that is not supposed to own the process or protect the appearance of success. This does not mean the third line should be adversarial or disconnected from reality. It means its perspective should be sufficiently separate that its conclusions are useful for governance rather than simply echoing management's own view. The strength of the three lines of defense model comes from the relationship among the lines, not just from the individual job of each line in isolation. The first line owns and manages risk within operations. The second line guides, monitors, and challenges so the enterprise retains consistency and leadership gets a more organized picture of exposure. The third line evaluates whether the whole arrangement is working and whether leadership's trust in the system is justified. When these lines understand each other and respect their different roles, the organization is much less likely to suffer from duplicated effort or dangerous gaps. The first line does not wait passively for audit findings before doing its job. The second line does not take over the first line's accountability and become the owner of every business decision. The third line does not become an unofficial operations team that quietly redesigns the process it is supposed to assess independently. Clear boundaries matter because once the lines collapse into each other, the model stops providing clarity and starts creating confusion disguised as collaboration. One of the most common problems in real organizations is that the first line tries to push too much responsibility upward, especially when risk topics feel technical, formal, or politically uncomfortable. A business team may assume that if the security group knows more about the issue, then the security group must own it. That belief may feel convenient, but it weakens governance because it disconnects risk from the business objective being affected. The process owner, service owner, or business leader remains accountable for the outcome even if specialists help explain the technical aspects. Another common problem is that the second line becomes too operational. When it spends too much time running controls, approving every local action, or behaving like a substitute manager, it starts weakening the very accountability structure it was supposed to support. The third line can also be pulled in the wrong direction if leadership expects it to provide constant design advice while still being fully independent in later assessments. CRISC wants you to recognize these tensions because the model only works when organizations preserve both collaboration and separation in the right proportions. It is also important to understand what the model is not. It is not a guarantee that risk will always be managed well, and it is not a substitute for culture, leadership, sound policy, or competent people. An organization can have a beautiful chart showing 3 lines and still fail badly if the first line ignores control discipline, the second line lacks credibility, or the third line is underfunded and rarely heard. The model is also not meant to create walls so rigid that information stops moving. Good governance still depends on communication, shared awareness, and coordinated action across the lines. The real purpose of the model is clarity, not isolation. It helps the organization understand who manages, who oversees, and who assures. That clarity makes escalation more effective, reporting more meaningful, and leadership decisions more grounded in evidence. For beginners, this is a valuable reminder. Governance models are only useful when people treat them as practical tools for making responsibility visible, not as decorative diagrams meant to impress auditors or regulators while daily behavior stays exactly the same. A simple example can make the model feel more real. Imagine a financial services company that launches a new digital account platform. The first line includes the business managers, product owners, and operational teams responsible for using that platform to open accounts, verify customer information, and support transactions. They own the process risks tied to those activities and must operate the process within policy, control, and performance expectations. The second line includes the enterprise risk, compliance, security governance, and privacy teams that define key expectations, advise on regulatory and control requirements, review the risk posture, and raise concerns if the business drifts outside approved limits. The third line, usually IA, later reviews whether the governance, control design, and monitoring around that platform are actually working as intended and whether leadership has been given a trustworthy picture of the exposure. In that example, all 3 lines are involved, but they are not doing the same job. The clarity of those roles is what helps the organization move from vague responsibility to real accountability. For the exam, the biggest takeaway is that the 3 lines of defense model is really a framework for understanding accountability in risk management. Questions may not always use the model's name directly, but they often test the same underlying logic. Who owns the day-to-day risk in a business process? Which functions should provide policy guidance, oversight, and challenge without becoming the actual owners of the process? Which function should provide independent assurance to leadership about whether the overall control and risk environment is working? If you keep those distinctions clear, many scenario questions become easier. The best answer is often the one that preserves the model's discipline instead of allowing one line to absorb another line's role. CRISC rewards mature judgment, and mature judgment in this area means recognizing that strong risk management depends on both ownership and oversight, both guidance and independence, both operational action and candid evaluation. When the lines are clear, leadership gets a stronger system. When the lines blur, leadership often gets more activity but less truth. By the time you finish thinking through this model, the main lesson should feel very practical and very important. The 3 lines of defense model helps an organization divide risk responsibilities in a way that supports daily control, enterprise consistency, and independent assurance without pretending that any one group can do everything well by itself. The first line owns and manages risk where business work actually happens. The second line helps shape expectations, guide decisions, and monitor consistency across the enterprise. The third line provides independent assurance so leadership can trust, but verify, the picture it is being shown. That is why this topic belongs where it does and see risk. Before an organization can assess risk well, respond intelligently, and monitor honestly, it needs to understand who is responsible for which part of the job. The 3 lines of defense model provides that clarity, and once you understand it, a great deal of the certification starts to feel more connected because you can finally see how governance, accountability, oversight, and assurance fit together inside one larger system.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.